This is a conversation with Norman Finkelstein. He is an author, historian, and political scientist, the author of over 10 books, including The Holocaust Industry and Gaza, an inquest into its martyrdom. In this conversation, we discuss his motivations, the influence of his childhood, the impact of his work. We talk about the history of the Israel-Palestine conflict, the difficulty of picking a starting point. We also talk about condemning Hamas on October 7th and the possible culpability of Benjamin Netanyahu and the state of Israel. This is no time. If you like what you see, then do hit subscribe on YouTube, follow on Spotify, rate 5 stars on Apple Podcasts. This project takes a lot of my time, money, and efforts. If you'd like to see it continue, please consider making a donation on Patreon or Anchor. You can join as a member on YouTube, and I'm starting to experiment with giving members early access to these videos. Or you can also leave gifts on Instagram Reels, or you can buy super thanks on YouTube. If not through monetary channels, then do consider sharing these episodes, leaving your likes and comments, all forms of engagement. They really go a long way. For the forms of love and support, you can follow this channel on Instagram or Twitter, or follow me personally. And now, it's no time. At the end of your book, Gaza, an inquest into its martyrdom, you talk about Helen Hunt Jackson's book, A Century of Dishonor, in which she documented the injustices faced by Native Americans. And you say, present volume was modeled after her searing requiem. The author holds out faint hope that it will find an audience among its contemporaries. Still, the truth should be preserved. It is the least that's owed to the victims. Perhaps one day in the remote future, when the tenor of the times is more receptive, someone will stumble across this book, collecting dust on a library shelf, blow off the cobwebs, and be stung by the outrage at the lot of a people. If not forsaken by God, then betrayed by the cupidity and corruption, careerism and cynicism, cravenness and cowardice of mortal man. Let's start here. Why do you do this? Why do you write these books that you feel will collect dust on a library shelf and have cobwebs? Why do you fight this fight? Why do you put yourself out there every single day at the receiving end of death threats and hate speech and vitriol? Have you been able to introspect what's driving you even at this age? Why do you fight this fight?
I kind of think it doesn't require great introspection to figure it out. Obviously, motives are always complex. I had a good friend 30 years ago, 40 years ago. His name was Cyrus Wieser. And he once said to me, he was a very smart guy, shrewd about life. He said, quote, "No feeling is ever unalloyed," meaning there's always a mixture of motives. There's no such thing as pure motives. There are a couple of cases you can think of in history that I'm familiar with where there was a purity of motive. I think the leader of the Russian Revolution, Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, V.I. Lenin, his motive was pure. Bertrand Russell, who absolutely loathed Lenin, he said of him nonetheless that he said, Vladimir Ilyich Lenin is the most selfless, egoless person I have ever met in my life. He met him, he was a representative of the British Labour Party that visited Russia after the revolution. And he described Lenin in another passage as being a theory embodied. He was just a theory, Marxist theory, embodied. He had no personal motive, ego, anything. That's rare, obviously, rare to the point of, you might say, almost non-existent. In my own case, the motives are very simple, in my view. If I didn't speak and write what I believed, I would probably implode. I would explode internally. The lies, the misrepresentations, the falsifications, they, for some reason, I can't explain why, at a certain point in my life, the struggle for truth and justice with a capital T and a capital J, I do think they became pretty pure. You know, when you're a young man, there is the ego, there is the desire for, I never had a desire for fortune, never, but fame, yeah, there was that element, or attention. But as I got older, it was a kind of refining process or purifying process. I think the same thing, by the way, happened to Martin Luther King. When he started out, he was just what they call in our country, or at one point they called it, the black bourgeoisie. He came from a relatively affluent black family in the South. He was just a preacher. Obviously, he had other facets to his being. He did go quite far, actually very far, in his formal educational studies. But it wasn't part of the plan to become an activist and to foment a revolution, albeit nonviolent. And at the end of his life, this member of the black bourgeoisie, he's in Memphis, Tennessee, and he's there on behalf of the sanitation workers. You know, the down and out, the most down and out of the down and out. He was there because there was a strike of the black sanitation workers in Memphis. So the son of the black bourgeoisie had traversed a very long distance, and he knew he was going to be assassinated. Anybody who listens to that last speech, I've been to the mountaintop, I've seen the promised land. Longevity has its place, but there are things bigger than just living. It was an eerie, it was the most magnificent speech probably ever given in human history. Yes, I believe that. As a political speech, the most magnificent. He was delivering his own funeral oration. So that's a big distance to traverse. I can't say I traverse such a distance, but I do know that at a certain point, I didn't much care about the fame. I never cared about the fortune. And I was just driven by indignation at the lies, indignation at the falsities, the misrepresentations, which had real life consequences in the lives of people. I can't say which weighed heavier, the desire for truth or the desire for justice. I haven't been to the West Bank or Gaza in more than 20 years. It's unlikely I will ever see that place again. So the people have become something of an abstraction. I am the kind of person who kind of needs the human contact to remind me of the meaning of the cause. And I've not had that human contact. Obviously, I meet many Muslims, Arabs, and Palestinians in the course of my politics, but it's not quite the same thing. The closest is when you meet somebody who's fresh out of Gaza. So I don't have that same feeling of connection that I had in the past. So it's mostly the indignation at the lies. And that's what motivates me. Do I think anybody's going to read what I write? Not really. Not really. I think very few people have actually read what I've written. There was a time when I spoke, and there would be long lines wanting to meet with me or sign a book. And I remember, this is about 15 years ago now, maybe more even. People would say, Professor Finkelstein, I've read all your books. I took that with a grain of salt, but I assumed they had read something. And then a change occurred about 10 years ago. It would be the same long lines, but they would say, Professor Finkelstein, I've watched all your YouTubes. So I don't think the current generation reads very much. And my books are laborious. They are these forensic analyses of texts. They are even, I'm not here being facetious. They're difficult for me. I'm right now writing a book, and I'm using some old material for a book that sold next to no copies. So I'm going to incorporate it in the new book as an appendix. And the last couple of days, I have to reread it because now I have the distance. The book came out several years ago. So I have the distance to see which parts of it are not entirely clear. When you read a book, when you write a book and then you read it right after, because you've made all the mental connections in your mind, everything seems logical and lucid. But when you read it 3 years later, you realize how many gaps there are, that they were in your mind, the links, but they're not on the page. That's why you need the distance of several years, really, to see what you still need to spell out. Just to reiterate, the links, you don't realize they were in your mind. They weren't on the page. You didn't spell out enough of the argument. So I'm rereading some things that one thing in particular I wrote several years ago. I find it very difficult. I find it difficult. I acknowledge it. And you might say, well, what's the point of writing something which you acknowledge yourself is difficult and few people are going to read? And the answer to that is simple. For those who, not simple, but the answer is for those who want to know the truth, it's there. If you're willing to do the hard work of laborious work, tedious work, of going through the argument, it's there. And if you're not, it's useless. I recognize that. I want it to be there. I want the truth to be there. When I say the truth, I'm pretty confident that what I'm writing is accurate. Mostly because when you're a dissident, when you go against the current, there are 10,000 people out there who would like to do nothing more than to expose you, to discredit you, and so forth. So when you're reading when you're writing and when you're rereading what you wrote, you always have the devil's advocate in the back of your head. But he may say this, she may say that. How do I answer that objection? How do I answer that objection? So I'm pretty confident that what I'm writing is, if not the truth, probably as close as you can get to it at the present moment. So it's there. It's there. The truth is, in my opinion, the truth is there to be had if you're willing to do the work.
Noam Chomsky had a similar epiphany when he said, you shouldn't do things because you hope to win. You should just do things because you should do it. Like the truth should be preserved.
Well, he actually, he took that, as he acknowledged. He took that from Confucius.
Right.
Confucius, it was said of Confucius that he persevered on his path in the certain knowledge that it was hopeless. He persevered on his path in the certain knowledge that it was hopeless. And when Professor Chomsky brought that text to my attention, I realized, you often, people call me, especially in recent times, they call me the voice of gloom, because I have very little, if any, optimism about the situation in Gaza, and now it appears in the West Bank as well.
Yeah.
And they say, then why should we do anything? And I have come to give 3 answers, discrete answers. Number 1, I might be wrong. Professor Chomsky, who was a very close friend of mine for 40 years, I'm not sure if friend is the correct word. I would say I benefited from his personal presence for 40 years. He was wrong about many things. He said it openly, he thought the struggle in East Timor, which became a major issue for him, you may not know about it. It was a place that was conquered by Indonesia, and then a mass bloodletting occurred there. The biggest bloodletting proportion of the population in the post-World War II era. And he was very active, not the only one, but certainly played a formidable role. And he would say privately, it's totally helpless. It's hopeless.
Yeah.
Well, they did get their independence, So the first thing to bear in mind is I could be wrong. That's one reason to persevere. A second reason to persevere is it's incorrect that if you do nothing, then things will be the same. If you do nothing, they're going to get worse. So even if by acting, you're merely stabilizing a bad situation, it's still better than doing nothing and allowing the situation to get even worse. I do believe that the resistance to the genocide in Gaza, I believe that it puts certain limits on the Biden administration, not very stringent limits, I recognize that, but puts certain limits on the Biden administration, which then puts certain limits on the Netanyahu administration. And then the third reason you persevere is, as you paraphrase Professor Chomsky, the third reason you persevere is because it's the right thing to do. You don't do something because you have a good or a bad chance at winning. You do it because it's the right thing to do. There's one qualification to that which I never had the opportunity to ask Professor Chomsky because it never occurred to me to ask him. And that is, Let's say there are two causes. One cause, hopeless. The other cause, there is a possibility if you invest your person, you invest your energy, you mobilize masses of people, it's a possibility you might win. And then the question becomes, why invest in a hopeless cause where the same energy invested in a, let's call it 50-50 cause may actually achieve victory? I think that's a tougher question.
Yeah.
If, I could, let's take my mundane world. I could invest in my students, my teaching, where you can, as a professor, you can change the lives of quite a number of students. I have had students who I know I changed their lives. So you could say, you know what, forget this Gaza stuff. It's a total waste of time. There's no possibility of achieving anything. Just invest all of your energies in teaching, where you can shape people's minds, change their futures, open up new possibilities. I think that's a real question, and I don't have the answer to that.
I want to zoom in on your motivations and your desires a bit more.
Mm-hmm.
You're the child of Holocaust survivors. Your
Mm-hmm.
parents were in the Warsaw Ghetto when the ghetto uprising was suppressed. Your mother was in the Majdanek concentration camp. Your father...
Both my parents, after the suppression of the uprising, there were about 20, the estimates are about 30,000 people survived, and they were all deported to Majdanek.
Your father was in the Auschwitz death march. Both your parents lost their entire families to the Holocaust. And you've said in your book, The Holocaust Industry, that my earliest memory, so to speak, of the Nazi Holocaust is my mother glued in front of the television watching the trial of Adolf Eichmann when I came home from school. Although they had been liberated from the camps only 16 years before the trial, an unbridgeable abyss always separated in my mind the parents I knew from that. You said in the past that your parents had a turbulent, tormented marriage, probably because they never recovered from what happened to them and their family on both sides. Your mother once told you, for all the horrors of the marriage, we never disagreed on politics. They were pro-Stalin, pro-Russia, pro-Soviet because Stalin defeated the Nazis, and they stayed loyal to Stalin even after Nikita Khrushchev distanced the Soviet Union from Stalin. This was the house you grew up in, and you said it was a fluke of fate that you grew up in a political home, and not just your home itself. Even the times were extremely political. The civil rights movement, the Vietnam War were salient movements of your generation. How much of this milieu, this political home you grew up in, the political times you grew up in, how much of that has directly influenced the person you are today? If you had to dissect this desire to preserve truth and justice, how much of that is a direct influence of your childhood?
I would say my engagement, involvement in politics is certainly a result of the family I grew up in. But I would say my parents were very intelligent. There's no question about that. And it wasn't unusual in that era. They read the New York Times religiously each day. Sunday mornings, I remember, when we sat around the table for breakfast, we would distribute, you have no concept of what the New York Times was back then, but it was a very hefty, the Sunday paper was very hefty. It had like 10 or 12 sections, as they were called. So section 2 was the theater and movie section. They would have a very thick book review section. It was like 100 and something pages. Yes. They had section 5 was the news of the week in review, which you had to read for school. In my social studies class, they would quiz you on the news of the week in review. So I'm not saying my parents were aberrant, but we did read the papers. Sunday, I hated it. I will tell you, I hated it because we only had one television back then. We sat around because my parents wanted to watch Meet the Press. Meet the Press was the standard news program on Sunday mornings. And we all sat and we watched Meet the Press. I found it boring, but that was the ritual. So the interest in politics, and I would say an intelligent interest in politics, which is to say, we didn't read what were called back then the tabloids with the screaming headlines. Right. We would read, there were several papers which were considered serious. There was the New York Telegram, there was the New York Times, there were several. And then there were several which were considered unserious. We read the serious papers. But I would have to say my approach to politics, for better or worse, and I'm not going to claim either way, it took a more cerebral bent than my parents. At the end of her life, my mother became a voracious reader. I mean, the way she consumed books was beyond belief. She would go to the library, ask the librarian, recommend some books. She would walk out with 5 or 6 books, come back 2 days later and say to the librarian, "Can you recommend some more books?" And the librarian would say, "You read all those books?" She said, "Yeah." Just lied in bed and, oh my gosh. I could even tell you a funny story. My father wasn't at his facility in English, was not on my mother's level. She knew Latin from school, so the English came easier to her. So once, my father was in Auschwitz and in the Auschwitz Death March, and also in the DP camp, displaced people camp, in Linz, Austria, with a fellow named Yisrael Gutman. And Gutman eventually became one of the directors of Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Memorial Museum in Israel. And he wrote a book on the Warsaw Ghetto, on Warsaw and the Warsaw Ghetto, but mostly it was the Warsaw Ghetto. So when Gutman writes the book, it comes out in English, and of course my father wants to read it. It's about the Warsaw Ghetto. And he reads it, and my mother hears about the book. They were divorced at this point. My mother hears about the book. She says, "Tell your father to bring me the book. I want to read the book. Tell your father, I want to read the book." So days elapse, and then weeks elapse. And finally, my father hands me the book to give to my mother. I give my mother the book. 2 or 3 days later, I come back to my father with the book. I said, "Mom is returning the book." And my father looked at me half with embarrassment and half with awe. He said, "She already finished it?" I said, "Yeah." That was her. She was good. She was good. But they did not have a cerebral approach to politics. They did not. They had this attitude, which wasn't good, I don't believe, that they had passed through the war. They knew everything there needed to be known about politics. They didn't have to read. It was like whenever you would talk about the war in Vietnam or any other episode, my mother would say indignantly, "What do you know about war?" That book knowledge was of trivial, or its insights were trivial to real life experience, which is true, but it's not just the war, it's what's going on behind the war and what is the thinking behind, and that part they didn't much care for. So, to make a long story short, I became at some point what's called a Marxist. And that meant, in order to be a Marxist, you had to be serious about the life of the mind.
Yeah.
Marxism was, for sure, activism, but it was activism which it was assumed was informed by this, so to speak, high theory. So if you look at the bookshelf, you'll see I have 1, 2, 3, 4 editions of Marx's Capital.
Yeah.
So I read it, the first edition I read twice. I then read the second edition, and then I read the third edition. That I was very serious about this life of the mind, which my parents were not. Not that they were dismissive of intellect and intelligence, they just didn't see its place in politics. Politics to them was very black and white. It was straightforward. It didn't require any great insight to understand its mechanisms. So that part, I can't say it came from home. It came in part because I grew up in a milieu which attached a lot of value to the life of the mind. My friends were very smart, and in order to keep up with them, you had to be a voracious reader. And I wanted to be in that crowd. And then once I embarked on the route of being a radical, and then you combine that with the attachment I had to the life of the mind, it became, my politics then became, you could say, they became more cerebral.
One final question I have about your motivations, and then we'll dive into the conflict.
Mm-hmm.
In the book Beyond Good and Evil, Friedrich Nietzsche had said the following words: "He who fights with monsters might take care lest he thereby become a monster. And if you gaze long enough into the abyss will gaze back into you." There's a scene in the documentary American Radical, The Trials of Norman Finkelstein, where your friend Musa Abu Hashash describes an instance where you couldn't recount a story of a young boy getting shot in front of your eyes at the Al Amari refugee camp in Ramallah without breaking down into tears every single time.
Mm-hmm.
What is the price you pay every single day for fighting this fight? If you tell me that this doesn't eat at you internally, being at the receiving end of all this vitriol and comments about you and the exposure to death, destruction, war, and the grief of war, if you tell me it doesn't eat at you internally daily, I'll be surprised. And then I'll ask you advice for how to build up this type of mental fortitude. Is there a price you pay? Is it a burden? Is it an albatross across your neck? Does it affect you?
The only thing that affects me is, at this point, because it happens to be Gaza, and I had written the only political history of Gaza, a lot of people have had high expectations of me, because I'm able at a factual, intellectual level, I'm able to respond to the lies and the falsities. And I've not had, I've not had the kinds of mental energy I wish I possessed to do the magnitude of work that is required of me in order to meet the expectations that people have in me. So I admire the physical energy of a Bernie Sanders, who is considerably older than myself, but seems to have inexhaustible physical energy. But I don't have the mental energy of a Noam Chomsky, who, up until 95, his mind was literally as nimble as if he were a 20-year-old. The way he fielded questions on Ukraine and a half dozen other issues of political contention was very impressive. And the same thing is true of Ralph Nader. Ralph Nader is still on the top of his game. When you listen to him, he knows all the facts, all the figures, and he's 90 years old.
Mm-hmm.
I just have had a lot of trouble summoning forth the mental wherewithal. Last night, I decided I'm going to read Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. And it's a hefty 6 volumes. And I said, I'm going to do it. I don't care, come what may. And so I started it last night. And then after around an hour, I said, okay, let me just take a short nap and get back to it. It was, I think, 11:45. And I just knocked out. I said, at some point in the middle of the night, I said, this is not going to happen. So that to me, the emotional burdens are very few for a very simple reason. I don't look at any of the news on Gaza. I don't read any of it. I just block it out because I know it's just going to demoralize me and depress me. And I just say, no, you're doing this. This is what you set yourself to do. You're just going to do it and just forget about what's happening because that can only make you feel hopeless. So I block it out. I always say God's wisest creature was the ostrich. Bury your head in the sand. Don't look at what's going on to the right of you, the left of you, in front of you, or in back of you. Just do your work because you only have control over what you can do. You have no control over the rest.
I think it's a very sensible approach, and I think it's good advice. Before we dive into the meat of the conflict and the questions I have for you, I think it would be a good exercise if we can provide a very quick overview, maybe a 5-minute overview of the Israel-Palestine conflict. It's an unfair question, I understand. But if you can just provide a very brief overview of how this conflict started, what were the key events, what are the Cliff's notes on how we got to the current conflict?
I don't think it's possible to do something like that. I think one can... If we want the background to the situation in Gaza, I think the essential facts are that there was a war in 1948, usually called the First Arab-Israeli War. In the course of that war, large numbers of the indigenous population in what became Israel were expelled. The numbers usually run to about 750,000. Of those 750,000, about 300,000 ended up in Gaza. And so they then constituted about 70 to 80% of the population of Gaza. The expellees overwhelmed in numbers those who were living in Gaza at the time. And that population, as I said, it constitutes about 70% of the population today in Gaza. So the first fact to know about Gaza is when you watch the news reports and the pictures coming out of Gaza, that 70% of Gaza are either refugees or descendants of refugees. Mm-hmm. And under international law, descendants of refugees are also classified as refugees. So Gaza is an overwhelmingly child population, overwhelmingly refugee population. And then half of Gaza's population are children. So those are, I think, the two salient facts about Gaza: overwhelmingly a refugee population and half a child population. Now, if you go back and look at the historic record, one of the striking things I only recently discovered was that from the very beginning, outsiders who went to visit Gaza, and now I'm referring to the beginning, which is Gaza after 1948 came under Egyptian administration. And it was under Egyptian administration until 1967, when Israel, in the course of another war, the June 67 war, Israel conquered Gaza. There's one continuity from 48 to the present. Not only one, but among them, one continuity is every outside observer, or I should say many outside observers, they described Gaza as a concentration camp. Beginning in the mid-50s, the main UN representative in Gaza, his name is E.L.M. Burns. He writes a book about his stint as a UN representative in Gaza. How does he describe Gaza? A concentration camp. Most people in this room will remember Al Gore, who ran for president in 2000. He was a senator. His father was a senator.
Yeah.
His father visits Gaza in 1967 after the June War. How does he describe Gaza? He goes before Congress. He's giving his testimony on his trip to Gaza, and he says it's a concentration camp. The head of the Israel National Security Council, his name is Giora Eiland. He's still around and still a very nasty piece of work. But he describes Gaza as, quote, and this is in 2004, a huge concentration camp. And so you see that continuity. Now, you can quarrel about whether the term is accurate, but you can't quarrel with the fact that reflexively all outside observers who went there, the image that came to mind was a concentration camp. Now, that's really only a third of the story, because after 2006, when Hamas is elected into power, Israel imposes this medieval siege on Gaza, effectively reducing, as they said themselves, to a humanitarian minimum, which is just the euphemism for a starvation plus diet on the people of Gaza. All of Gaza is hermetically sealed. Nothing can go in, nothing can go out. No person can go in, and no person can go out without Israel's approval. So you have this concentration camp, which has now come under this brutal medieval siege. And then there's a third layer, which is that every few years or few months, depending on the period, Israel launches one of its operations in Gaza, which is just a euphemism for these high-tech killing sprees in Gaza. So by October 6th, the people of Gaza the young people, for example, who burst the gates of Gaza concentration camp on October 7th, by the eve of October 7th, most, if not all, of those young men had been born in a concentration camp. They had languished in that concentration camp, and it was certain that they would die in that concentration camp. Now, you might say, but I leave out an important element, and that element is, why didn't Hamas try to, the elected leadership, why didn't it try to resolve this matter so as to end the siege and so forth? But the answer to that is they did. They tried diplomacy. They tried international law. In March 2018, they tried nonviolent civil resistance. I don't have the time now to go through the details, but they did try every avenue of possibility to achieve a degree of normalcy. The other point to make, which ought to be obvious, is Hamas wasn't elected into office until January 2006.
Mm-hmm.
But the siege of Gaza, the turning of it into a concentration camp, the sealing of it, SEAL, the sealing of it, that began around 1990. It was called the policy of closure, CLOSURE. That long preceded Hamas. So I don't think it's accurate, based on the documentary record, to say that Hamas was an obstacle to resolving the problem. First of all, the problem preceded Hamas. The closure policy begins around 1990, 15 or so years before Hamas is even elected. And number two, they did try. I mean, even now, I've read it so many times, but I was rereading something I had written a while ago, and the scenes during what was called the Great March of Return, when Palestinians tried nonviolent civil resistance in order to break the siege of Gaza. And the scenes that are depicted in the exhaustive UN report of the Israeli snipers lined along the perimeter fence with Gaza, aiming their weapons from afar, 100 meters, 200 meters, 300 meters, 800 meters away at Palestinians against a tree, just leaning against a tree, of double amputees, of medics running to rescue people who are shot. And the snipers, and Israel says, every bullet hit its target, which I believe is true. These were among their best snipers. Shooting the kids in the back of the head, shooting the double amputees, aiming at the kneecap and below to inflict life-changing injuries. Even now, I shake my head. I do. Just the other night, because some people say that some of the language I've used in recent years is a little bit over the top when I describe Israel as a satanic state. And then I have to, of course, because people who have criticized me on that count, I respect very much. So I have to think hard whether am I going over the top? But then I read the descriptions. No, it's Israel that's over the top. I am simply describing what they're doing.
Thank you for that overview. I know it was an unfair question to try and encapsulate that into a short answer, but I think we have a good foundation now to start exploring all the questions. This is what I want to achieve today. I've read your books, not all your books, as people tell you. I've watched your YouTube videos as well. I know your stance on Gaza. What I want to do today is I want to channel some of the questions that pro-Israeli supporters and Zionists bring up, because every day I get the feeling that both sides are in their own echo chambers and screaming at each other. No one's listening. And I have this foolishly ambitious dream, you may call it naive dream, of trying to bridge the gulf today. So you mentioned playing devil's advocate, the devil's advocate in your mind. I'm going to try to step into their shoes and play devil's advocate to your stance, even if, regardless of that, if that requires a leap across the chasm of my own morality. And I must admit that if I step into the shoes of Israeli supporters and Zionists, they raise a few questions that I struggle to answer personally. And since I have one of the leading historians with me, I hope you can help me resolve those questions today. That's the objective. The first question that I struggle to answer is, how do you pick a starting point? Your book, Gaza, an Inquest into its Martyrdom, and your answer today both start with 1947, the UN partition plan, and then the first Arab-Israeli War of 1948. There are references to the Balfour Declaration and the British Mandate of 1917, but that's it. I think the big problem is Zionists and Israel supporters, they want to start earlier. Many of them make the case that you should start with biblical times. You should start with Canaan, or the kingdom of Israel, or the kingdom of Judah, or you should start with the Roman Empire and the Masada myth, going all the way till the Ottoman Empire. And I'm aware that your career started when you debunked Joan Peters from time immemorial about the demographic history of Palestine, but they want to start even earlier from that. How do you pick a starting point? Why have you started with 1947? And can you go earlier? If you go earlier, does that change anything?
I think starting points are always a problem.
Right.
No question in my mind about that. Some starting points strike me as ludicrous. So we'll take a simple example. If somebody were to knock, I've been living in this apartment that you're in now for 30 years. My father was here. I took over the apartment from my father. He was here for 15 years. I don't own the apartment. I pay rent, as did my father. So somebody knocks on my door, and he will say he's holding a hefty tome in his hands, and he says to me that according to my Bible, my family lived here 3,000 years ago, and this is my apartment, and you should leave. That doesn't seem to me a plausible argument. You would tell the person to make a beeline for Bellevue Hospital. Well, and I find it as ludicrous to try to justify a historical claim based on something 3,000 years ago. For all I know, he might be right. There's no way for me to disprove him, and I wouldn't try to disprove him. I wouldn't make the effort, because I think the elapse of 3,000 years cancels or nullifies that right. So I don't think that's a tenable starting point. And the Zionists understood that. They understood that wasn't a tenable starting point. They claimed a historic right, but they also recognized that a population was there. There was no rational grounds for that population to defer to that historic right. The Zionist arguments ranged very widely. Some of them said, I would say the best of the arguments said, well, there are X number of Arab states in the region, that the Arabs didn't have what you might call a distinct identity, and that no great crime would be committed if, say, the Arabs from Palestine went to live in Jordan or went to live in Iraq. It's still Arab territory. But they said the Jews have a distinct problem, that they are the only people without a state. Arabs could still have their Arab state if they moved to Jordan, so on and so forth.
Yeah.
But Jews have no state. And therefore, on balance, the bigger injustice is the one being done to Jews as against the one being done to Arabs. Arabs are just moving from one Arab state to the next.
Mm-hmm.
Jews have no state to move to. I'm old enough to recognize there are arguments on all sides, and that there's elements to that argument that are tenable. And then there is compounding that argument is the fact that the experience of the Nazi Holocaust seemed to confirm that nobody wanted the Jews and that the Jews needed a place of refuge because the world could not be counted on to protect them in that moment of truth.
Mm-hmm.
And therefore they needed their own state. And that's a compelling argument. I would say the reason I start with 1947 is because I do believe there were some realistic actors on the stage. They were self-interested, but there was an element of decency. So the most memorable for Jews, the most memorable speech that was given at the time of the partition resolution by the UN, the most memorable speech by a wide margin was the one by Foreign Minister Gromyko
mm-hmm.
of the Soviet Union. Now, Gromyko is Stalin's man, couldn't have been a very nice guy, must have been a very thick-skinned guy, couldn't have been easy to sit through Politburo meetings or Central Committee meetings with Mr. Stalin, where your only job is to say yes. Nonetheless, he gives a speech. Now, bear in mind, the Soviet Union lost about 30 million people during World War II. It was a mass extermination. It wasn't like the war on the Western Front. The war on the Western Front was more or less conventional. Prisoners of war were treated more or less okay. On the Eastern Front, the Nazis were out to annihilate the Soviets in order to create living space, what they call Lebensraum. And they carried on mass extermination. So it was about 30 million Russians who were wiped off from the face of the earth. Nonetheless, when you read Gromyko's speech, he says that we support one state in Palestine. We prefer one state. But if there's no way for the two parties to get along, meaning the Palestinian Arabs and the Jews in Palestine, if there's no way for them to reconcile between themselves, Gromyko says, the suffering of the Jews during World War II was so terrible. It's, as I said, a remarkable statement coming from a country which lost on its own 30 million people. It was so terrible that if they can't get along, then the Jews should get a state. So I start from there because I think the way the UN handled the question, it was probably reasonable for the time. The partition resolution. Now, as a practical matter, it wasn't going to happen because half the population of the Jewish state was Arab, as it was calculated then. There was this tiny Jewish majority in the anticipated Jewish state. And the Zionists would never have accepted that. They would have, by hook or by crook, they would have gotten rid. Now, of course, they got fortunate. There was a war. And so in the course of the war, right now, it's exactly what's happening now. The Israelis are using the excuse of what happened in Gaza to slowly but surely empty out the West Bank. They won't accept anything less than a tiny minority of Arabs in their state. So I don't think the UN plan was practical. It couldn't have resolved the problem. But on the other hand, it recognized some realities, which I think there was an element of justice to. So I'm not dogmatic on this. I've always supported what's called the international consensus, a term coined by Professor Chomsky. Namely, there's a long UN record of calling for two states, roughly from the early 1970s, calling for two states in the June 1967 border, a Palestinian state beside an Israeli Jewish state. You could sit in a graduate school seminar and make your case for any of your particular solutions: a federal state, a binational state, a democratic secular state, a confederation with Jordan. There are 10,000 permutations and combinations. Yeah. But I think that's the stuff for graduate student seminars where you're engaged in this abstract search for the just solution. In the real world, I think the UN proposals have been more or less reasonable. But Israel has rejected them. The Palestinians did accept them. You could see that in the voting records over and over again. For the last 20 years, there's been this resolution in the UN General Assembly called Peaceful Settlement of the Palestine Question. Mm-hmm. And it's basically two states in the June 67 border. Israel has to dismantle the settlements and so on and so forth. All the terms of which everyone's familiar. And the vote's always the same. The whole world on one side, the United States, Israel, and some South Pacific atolls, Palau, Nauru, the Marshall Islands on the other side. So the essential point is that a reasonable settlement, I'm not sure if it's any longer possible, but had been possible for at least 30 years. Well, no, 50 years now. But the US, Israel, backed by the United States, rejected it.
Let's bring up the second question that I struggle with. And this is the notorious question of condemnation. Do you condemn what Hamas did on October 7th? And you have a very interesting answer to this. You've said that I think it's a question mark how Hamas on October 7th is going to be regarded in the future. You have drawn parallels to the slave rebellions of 1831, when Nat Turner explicitly targeted whites. And objectively, it was a horrific act of violence, atrocious. But despite that, Frederick Douglass has said that you can draw a straight line from Nat Turner.
No, Frederick Douglass said you can draw a straight line from John Brown
Right.
to the Civil War. But John Brown says he was inspired by Nat Turner.
Right.
So you could say on a trajectory, Nat Turner was 1 point, John Brown was a 2nd point, the Civil War, the 3rd point.
Okay. So by extension, you can draw that line from Nat Turner to John Brown to the Civil War. And then from there to the abolition of slavery and the Emancipation Proclamation. Objectively positive outcomes. So despite Nat Turner committing this condemnable act of violence, now he occupies an honored place in history.
Yeah.
And you say, in light of that, it's a question mark. What place Hamas on October 7th is going to occupy in history. Before I tell you where I struggle with this argument, I just want to check with you. Have I summarized your stance correctly? Have I missed anything?
That's correct.
Okay, great. This is where I struggle with this argument. Frederick Douglass was able to see a line connecting John Brown to the Civil War, and we're able to see that influence John Brown had from Nat Turner. But if I try to apply the same protocol to other acts of violence that I condemn, then it dilutes everything. And then I lose free will, no accountability, there's complete chaos. I'll give you a very intentionally extreme example. In 1978, after the Saur Revolution, the United States funded the rise of the Mujahideen to oppose the Soviet Union and the Soviet-backed People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, the PDPA. By funding the Mujahideen, they also funded the rise of this man named Osama bin Laden, who broke out from the Mujahideen and formed Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda declared war on the US. They took great offense to the United States military presence in Saudi Arabia after the Gulf War, the Kuwait War. They opposed US funding and support for Israel. They opposed the sanctions on Iraq. And then the US involvement in multiple Islamic countries. Declared war on the US. That led to 9/11. You already know where I'm going with this. You can draw a straight line from the US funding of the Mujahideen to Osama bin Laden, to Al-Qaeda, to 9/11. And I'm saying, I don't care about the context and I don't care where the line is drawn. I grew up in the Middle East. So I know, I completely agree with you that the United States destroyed Afghanistan, destroyed Iraq, has destroyed Palestine, is destroying Iran. I think the United States is directly responsible for the deaths of hundreds of thousands of civilians. Their policy has been a lot more. Their policy has been nefarious and they have blood on their hands. I completely agree with you. But despite that context, I don't think it's a question mark what place 9/11 holds in history. Even if you draw that line all the way to 9/11, there's no question mark in my mind. It was a horrific act. It was an act of violence. And there's no question mark what place it occupies in history.
I think you miss a couple of things. First of all, I've never said it wasn't a horrific thing. I've repeatedly said there can be no question that atrocities of a significant magnitude occurred on October 7th. As of now, people still debate to what extent Israel was responsible for the atrocities on October 7th. I would say based on the currently available information, the only reasonable conclusion is that overwhelmingly the civilian deaths that occurred on October 7th were due to the actions of Hamas, of Gaza militants.
Mm-hmm.
However, as I said, number one, I recognize those were atrocities and they can't be characterized as anything but. But there's, in my opinion, a distinction to be made between an acknowledgement of the atrocities and a condemnation of those who perpetrated the atrocities. So let me try to concretize that. We have the case of Nat Turner. He's born a slave. And it happens he's a very smart guy. It is. Everybody said about Nat Turner, white and black. They all said, that Nat's a very smart guy. The fellow who famously wrote his confession, there was the Confessions of Nat Turner. He said that he rarely met a person, black or white, who was as smart as this guy. Okay? And Nat Turner was not unaware of his natural gifts, those endowments from God or from whoever you believe they came. And he knew that, bar a miracle, he would never be able to realize any of his gifts, any of his talents. He was born a slave, he would live as a slave, and he was going to die as a slave. Now, in his mind, there was no other option than to commit some sort of mass killing in order either to inspire an uprising or to foment an uprising or to transmit a message to the white population that if you don't end this slavery, this is what you risk. This is what's on the horizon for you. He thought those were the only two, that was the only option for him. Kill all white people, though he said later, and nobody disputes it, he said once we got a firm grounding, he would stop killing whites, innocent whites, civilians. But he felt as a tactical matter, the only option he had at the beginning was to carry out this gruesome, ghastly massacre of white people, men, women, and children. Mm-hmm. So let's say you were in the court of law and you were the prosecutor, and Nat Turner was on the witness stand. You are white. You represent, you embody, you incarnate this whole system of slavery. You're part of it. You're part of the machinery of slavery. Okay? And do you believe that you could interrogate Nat Turner sitting on the witness stand and indignantly saying to him, Nat Turner, do you realize what a horrible crime you committed? Do you realize how beastly, how bestial, how uncivilized your action was? So I ask you, do you believe that you occupied the moral high ground such that you could scold and reprimand in indignant cadences what Nat Turner did? Or would you have sufficient moral self-awareness to say, what happened was horrible, but then full stop, because you had no right knowing as you did what slavery was, knowing as you did the life he had lived and the prospects that he faced of slavery to earthly eternity, you had no right to criticize him. You can criticize the act, but you don't have the moral high ground to criticize him, which is exactly why the white abolitionists, those who opposed slavery at the time, they condemned the act, but they stopped short of condemning Nat Turner. On the contrary, they reserved all of their venom and indignation at the whites, saying, "We told you so. We warned you. We warned you again and again and again. If you treat people this way, don't be surprised at what they might do." And when I read that by people like William Lloyd Garrison, who was one of the leading abolitionist figures, I thought to myself, that was the correct moral approach. A version of condemn the sin, but not the sinner. This is a version of it. You can condemn what was done, but you don't have the moral high ground to condemn the perpetrators, because I spent a large part of my life, a small part of which can be seen here, just reading the reports on Gaza and what was being done to those people. And I, not because of some flamboyant radicalism or radicalness or trying to show how holier than thou and how pure I am, or trying to win points with Hezbollah or Hamas. No, I just said I couldn't do it. I know too much. One of the titles of one of my books was called Knowing Too Much. And it was about why American Jews were distancing themselves from Israel. Namely, they know too much about how ugly that regime is. And I knew too much about Gaza. I knew too much. There was no way on God's earth, and I would have regarded it as a complete and total betrayal of the values imparted to me by my parents based on their life experience, were I to take the easy route and say, you know, in response to Piers Morgan, do you condemn what happened? Yes, I condemn it, but we have to remember this and have to remember that. No, I was not going to even grant, many people like Bernie Sanders would say, what happened October 7th, but we have to remember the Palestinian this and Palestinian that. And you start by condemning October 7th. That was sort of the gate. You had to pass through that gate in order to be part of the conversation. If you wouldn't do the condemnation, you're not part of the conversation. And I wouldn't do the condemnation, not because I wanted to strike a radical pose. I knew too much. And I knew exactly that was why the abolitionists couldn't condemn Nat Turner, because they walked in the streets. They saw the slave auctions. They saw the humiliation, the degradation, the destruction of the lives of a whole people was right before their eyes. The difference with me was You see, Gaza was sealed off. How many people had a clue what was going on in Gaza? They just knew this place, Gaza. They didn't even know. Actually, most people didn't even have a clue that you weren't allowed to leave. Most people thought, why don't they just go somewhere else? Well, guess what? They couldn't. I knew too much. There was no way. I never for a moment hesitated about condemning them. My problem was very simple. I didn't know how to think it through. I knew I wouldn't condemn them, but I didn't know how to think through the argument. And I went through, I would say, a good week or more of real anguish and agony over, it's not just your feeling. How do I persuade? How do I convince that mine is the correct approach? And that took time to think through. It did.
Is violence an integral part of every resistance movement? Every liberation movement in history has been split on this principle of violence versus non-violence. During the civil rights movement, this was a strong point of contention between the Black Panther Party, the Black Power movement, Nation of Islam, Malcolm X, and Martin Luther King. I know your book has a section called What Would Gandhi Say? And you mentioned the Great March of Return, which was a non-violent demonstration. Even in the Indian independence struggle, this was a point of contention between Mahatma Gandhi and Subhash Chandra Bose. Nelson Mandela himself conceded after the Sharpeville massacre that just non-violent methods, they're going to be insufficient. Many revolutionaries have advocated for the use of violence. Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana. Fidel Castro, in a speech interestingly titled, History Will Absolve Me, given everything we just spoke about, he said that we were taught that liberty is not begged for, but won with the blade of a machete. And after the 1956 Suez Canal crisis, the Second Arab-Israeli War, the streets of Cairo sang the songs of Kulthum, a rendition of Ahmad Shawqi's poem Saulu Kalbi, where they sang the words, Wama Nailu Matallabi Bittamani, Walakin tu Khudud al Dunya Galaba. Not through hope will the prize be obtained. The world must be taken through struggle. Can a resistance movement just survive on non-violence, or is it imperative and inevitable that you have to commit these condemnable acts of violence to actually reach your goal?
I can't say with any kind of certitude that in every situation one has to resort to violence, one has to resort to armed force. What I would say is the following. For two reasons, a moral reason and a practical reason. It should be the last resort. The moral reason is taking of human life is obviously, there but for the grace of God go I. You don't know how many days I marvel at the fact that I'm already reaching the end of my life, and I lived. How many lives in struggles for justice and truth? The protagonists, they died, they were killed. All of my heroes, except a couple, okay, Paul Robeson lived to the end of his life, W.E.B. Du Bois lived to the end of his life, but by and large, Martin Luther King was dead at 39, Malcolm X was dead at 39, Gandhi, okay, at an older age, but he was assassinated. I'm the fortunate one. I lived. And I like the fact that I clung to life. I do. I'm glad I lived. Not sure why, but I am. So there, but for the grace of God go I. One has to always bear in mind that the life that's lost could be your own. And if you cling to life and if you love life, I asked my super the other day, I said, always such a positive mood. You emit such positive energy. Why is that? And he said, because I love life. I love life. I'm so happy to be alive. So violence may sound trivial, but sometimes we have to remember the trivial fact, what seems to be trivial. Violence means loss of life. And so a morally serious person has to contend with the fact that once you make the resort to violence, you are going to be depriving a life or a large number of lives of that which you attach so much value to living. But there's also, I don't want to say but, I'll say and. There's a practical question. In any struggle for violence, in any struggle that involves violence, the most ruthless are the ones who end up on top. That's just a fact.
Yeah.
Those who are capable of manifesting the most violence, the most ruthless violence, once it's down to violence, the people who end up on top are not very nice people. That's just a fact. You know why Nelson Mandela ended up a nice person? Guess why? Because he was in jail. He didn't have to engage in the ugliness of that violent struggle. It wasn't all violent, but parts of it were. There was torture that was committed in the camps of the ANC. Came out during the Truth and Reconciliation process. He got to have clean hands because he was in jail. I think he would have been a very different person. You know, he once said of his wife, Winnie Mandela, who was pretty brutal. You know, she killed a member of what was called the Soweto Soccer Club, Stompy. She was cheering on the necklacing of the South African whites. You know, they put the tires around their necks and then set them on fire. And he said to her, he said in his autobiography, I have it over there, Strides, A Long Walk to Freedom. He said, actually, I think Winnie had it worse than me because Winnie was put in isolation. She was banned. He said, I was in jail. I had my comrades. Was it wonderful spending 28 years in Robbins Island? But he said, I think she actually had it worse than him. Worse than me, he said. And in the same way, I think that, along the same lines, one has to be cognizant of the fact that if you win a power struggle born of violence, you're not going to be a very nice guy. And it has, to put it, it's old-fashioned, it's cliche-ish, but it's true. Violence corrupts. And there's almost inevitably a trivialization of life that accompanies violence. I think that's what happened to Mao. Mao Zedong, the leader of the Chinese Revolution, in the course of the Civil War lasted about 30 years from the time the Chinese communists began and they win power in 1949. And in the course of that Civil War, every member of his family was killed. And that can't but have a callousing, a hardening effect on your soul. You come to see death in a kind of matter-of-fact way, and you begin to attach less significance to it. So Mao has, in my opinion, we can disagree till the end of time, he has a very humane vision of a communist society, and he is absolutely, sincerely committed to the transformation of the lives of the Chinese masses, those hundreds of millions of people who are steeped in the most numbing poverty, and he envisages a better life for them. But in the course of trying to realize that vision, he is very callous about life. And I think that's in part because of having gone through the Civil War, when he saw all of his relations get murdered, killed, die. That kind of violence has a callousing effect. It's not maybe the perfect analogy, but it kind of, even in the most humane and decent struggles, it has a kind of mafia-like callousing effect when you watch, The Godfather or other films, and the ease with which they extinguish life.
Mm-hmm.
So, for moral reasons, there but for the grace of God go I. And for practical political reasons, if you have a humane vision of what you want the outcome of politics to be, yes, violence may, and some, it may be many, it may be most instances, violence might be necessary, but you should always bear in mind it has to be the last resort. The last resort.
This ties in perfectly with the third, and I guess for the sake of this conversation, final question that I struggled with. I struggled with a lot of questions, but for now, we'll keep it to 3. You brought up who makes it to the top and the personality that would make it to the top. You also spoke about Mao's vision and the callousness that he executed that vision with. Let's bring up the third big question that I struggle to answer, which is the culpability of Benjamin Netanyahu and the state of Israel. In German history, there is the Sonderweg theory, the special path, which implies that the rise of the Third Reich or Nazi Germany was a consequence of the path that Germany was on. It was an inevitability. And I know that you don't completely agree because you've argued in A Nation on Trial that the Germans didn't vote for Hitler because of his anti-Semitism. But there are historians like A.J.P. Taylor in The Origins of the Second World War, Fritz Fischer in Germany's Aims in the First World War, that have alluded that Hitler was an inevitable outcome of Germany's political instability, the Treaty of Versailles, economic hardship, and the failures of the Weimar Republic, making it more prone to authoritarianism and extreme nationalism. So Hitler was not a bug of the system, he was a feature of the system. And then if it was not him, then the German public would have elected someone else who had a similarly ruthless, aggressive, radical ideology like Hitler. Is Benjamin Netanyahu in a similar position? There are only 2 possible scenarios. One, he's a perfect representation of what the public wants, what the public sentiment is. And if you want to make it to the top in Israel and stay at the top, then you have to do what he's doing at the moment. There's an Israeli expression, Ein Brea, no choice. Then Benjamin Netanyahu is just a perfect reflection of that. Or the second scenario is that, no, he's not the right representation of the public sentiment. He's an anomaly, an outlier. He's a warmonger. He's power hungry. Similar to Hitler in the Third Reich, is Benjamin Netanyahu a puppet of statewide ideology, or is he a perpetrator of it?
These questions questions of that sort are so complicated, and I don't possess the mental capacity to work through those arguments.
I'm sure you do.
No, I do not. They've been pondered since probably when history was first being written, the extent to which if something happened, was it therefore inevitable? Yeah. Because if it didn't happen, if the alternative didn't happen, there must have been a reason why it didn't happen. And therefore what happened is the ultimate product of what had to happen.
Yeah.
I don't I don't ponder those questions anymore. There was a point in my life when I pondered them. I think what's correct to say is you always get into these questions about what's sometimes called the great man theory of history, whether a single individual played a significant role or he or she was just the product of historical circumstances, you put it. If Hitler wasn't there, another person would have been there. There's a book, I'm sure I have it somewhere, by the Russian Marxist named Plekhanov.
Mm-hmm.
And he has a chapter on the great man theory of history. And he basically takes, I guess it's probably right over here. And the chapter is called, let's see, Man and Necessity in History. Whether something is the product of necessity or it's the product of, haven't read it in 100 years. Let's see. In any event, and I'm not about to, A, because I don't have the capacity, and B, the mental capacity, and B, because I don't think in the course of an interview you can answer that question, understand the relationship between the role of individuals or even the role of masses of people versus the role of the objective factors. So, what was the French Revolution an example of the subjective agency of the French people? Or were those people mobilized by virtue of objective factors? And so the revolution was inevitable. There are many examples. I don't believe there would have been anywhere near the dimensions of the Nazi Holocaust were it not for Hitler, that he harbored this particular. The Nazis didn't like Jews. I'm not going to dismiss that, but the organized magnitude of the Nazi Holocaust was clearly a product of Hitler himself. No, I wouldn't go as far as to say, as sometimes said, no Hitler, no Nazi Holocaust, but I think the magnitude, it would have been quite different without a Hitler. Leon Trotsky, one of the Russian revolutionists, the leading figure after Lenin, he said, no Lenin, no Russian Revolution. So there are people, even the most, people like Trotsky, who are the most Marxist in their interpretations, still see the role of individuals in changing the course of history. And then there are, of course, others like Plekhanov who say, no, if one person were, he said, if somebody had dropped a brick on Napoleon's head, there would have been somebody to take Napoleon's place. I'm pretty sure that was in Plekhanov. I remember the image. It's a famous image from his essay. What I would say, or I could say with a certain amount of certitude, is that Netanyahu is an accurate representative of Israeli society. It's not as if he is an excrescence. That's the fancy word for like an artificial outgrowth. He's not an excrescence. The fact that he is the longest sitting prime minister of Israel, there's a very good reason for it, because he is an obnoxious, self-righteous Jewish supremacist. And that is a reflection of 95% of Israeli society. Obnoxious Jewish supremacists, self-righteous society. So there, when I had one of these moments on the Piers Morgan program, and I said that about Netanyahu, Piers Morgan said, no, and all the other panelists said, no, he's very unpopular. Look at the polls. He's not going to win the next election. I think he will win the next election. I said it then, I say it now. The polls always say, he's going to, the pundits always, he's going to lose. I've been saying it since ages now. It doesn't happen. So that part I would agree with, that Netanyahu is less a orchestrator than he is a reflection of Israeli society. That part, I think, is correct. He is not this extraordinary agent, or I should say actor. He is a reflection of Israeli society.
In the Gulag archipelago, Alexander Solzhenitsyn had said that the line separating good and evil passes not through states, nor between classes, nor between political parties either, but right through every human heart and through all human hearts.
I think I have. I read all 3 volumes. Is 2, 1. I read 3. Must be here, but I read all 3.
I have no doubt that you have the collection.
They were hefty volumes.
Believe me, I have no doubt that you have the collection and that you've read it maybe 3 times like you always do.
The Gulag I didn't like. It was very repetitive. There was nothing new in volumes 2 and 3. Even the thing with Solzhenitsyn is he couldn't believe a word he said. There was a very permeable line between he is a historian and he is a novelist.
Right.
And it was impossible to know, is this accurate? You didn't get a feel that it was historically accurate, in my opinion. In any case, yes, the line runs through. I recognize that, but I also recognize people can make choices. I believe people can make choices. I know the question of free will is another one, like the role of the individual in history, where there's a vast amount of debate. But there's a wonderful passage in Rousseau's Second Discourse where he says, the laws of science, physics, can explain everything. They can explain thoughts, they can explain language, they can explain everything. But he says there's one thing that they can never explain. Why a person chooses to do A and not B. The will. No law, he says, no law of physics can ever explain that. And yes, I think it's inexplicable. And I think we all experience at different points in our life what might be called the moment of truth, where we're faced with the prospect of doing wrong or not doing wrong. We're faced with the choice of doing nothing and doing something. And no law of physics could ever explain why we choose to do something rather than nothing, to do evil rather than to do good. But we all feel we have a choice. So I'm not so ready to dismiss. I'm not so ready to forgive when people made the wrong choice. I'm a very old-fashioned, very unforgiving person. Never to forgive, never to forget. You knew the consequences of doing nothing. You knew the consequences of going along when something wrong was happening. You chose to do nothing. You chose to close your eyes. So you, knowing full well the consequences of your actions, you made the choice, you live with it. Do not expect me to forgive you. It's not going to happen. You live with it. You live with the consequences.
Can I ask you about that choice?
Mm-hmm.
Stokely Carmichael had given a speech in 1966 when he had said, the philosophers Camus and Sartre raised the question whether or not a man can condemn himself. The black philosopher who is pragmatic, Frantz Fanon, answered the question. He said that man could not. Were he to condemn himself, he would then have to inflict punishment upon himself. An example would be the Nazis. Any of the Nazi prisoners who, after he was caught and incarcerated, admitted that he committed crimes, that he killed all the many people he killed, had to commit suicide. The only ones who were able to stay alive were the ones who never admitted that they committed a crime against people. That is, the ones who rationalized that Jews were not human beings and deserved to be killed, or that they were only following orders. Is that the problem here? If you say that 95% of the state is willingly making a choice or has the illusion of that free will and they're going to be accountable for their actions, which, Professor, with all due respect, I think it's a reach if 95% of the state is willingly evil. If that is the case, and if there's blood on the hands of pretty much the entire nation, is that what's happening here? That they're convincing themselves that they're not committing a crime, and that's the only way to preserve your sanity?
95% are not committing crimes. 95% are simply preoccupied with the struggle of survival at different levels, paying their bills, paying their rent, getting a nice car, going on vacation. That's what most people are preoccupied with. And I don't begrudge that, actually. I don't. They're nice people. I don't try to enlist people in the cause with any kind of eagerness, because I recognize, especially in the country we live in now, very different in the 1960s when there was an overabundance, a superabundance of wealth, commodities. I realize how difficult the struggle for existence is, especially now, as I said.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't begrudge it. And I don't consider that being complicit in the commission of crimes. No, I don't. I suppose if they had more awareness of what was going on and they were utterly indifferent, that would be morally problematic. But most of them have virtually no awareness. And probably, like, You ask your average American now, they don't like what's happened in Gaza. Are they going to go out to a demonstration? No. Are they going to risk limb and life to stop it? No. But if you ask them, you think it's right? No, I think it's terrible, what's happening. So I wouldn't put that at a level of complicity.
Okay.
On the other hand, those who were directly involved, let's say in Gaza, the genocide in Gaza is a national project. It's not a state project. We should be very clear about that. It's enlisted the whole of civil society at every level, from the very top to the very bottom, across what is, in fact, a very narrow political spectrum. All the institutions of the military, and of civil society. So, in my opinion, and they're fully aware of what they're doing. Their brothers, their sisters, their mothers, their fathers, they post it all on the web. There's no claim, like it's a false claim, but at least the Nazis had the claim we didn't know. I mean, the Germans had the claim we didn't know.
Right.
Because officially it wasn't broadcast. They knew enough, but they had at least that alibi. The Israelis don't. So I have a very difficult now for me to talk to any Israeli, because I think they're all complicit actively in the genocide in Gaza. Remember, Israel is a citizen army. Now, in general, a citizen army is correct. Everybody should have to bear the price of defending the country, which is to say, risking their lives. There shouldn't be a category of people who risk their lives to defend a country. In our country, it's mostly poor people. That's why they recruit in the army. They sign up for the army. Israel has, to its credit, a citizen army. But when you're committing a genocide, that means everybody bears the responsibility for it. It's representative of all of Israeli society. So I can't forgive that. It's very different than my super. My super is wholly unaware of the crimes committed and is by our country, and is certainly not enthusiastic, were he to know. They're enthusiastic. They relish. There's glee at the extermination of the people in Gaza. That's no exaggeration. There are so many compendia now of just collections of statements at every level of Israeli society. The music, the lyrics in the songs, "May Gaza burn." So I can't forgive that. That again, that would be a complete betrayal of all the values imparted. My parents, there was no way on God's earth, none, that they would forgive any of the perpetrators. Because remember what it means. You're not forgiving the perpetrators of what was done to you. You're forgiving the perpetrators who exterminated your family. Do you have that right to forgive those who threw your mother, your father, your brother, your sisters into a gas chamber? Do you have the right to forgive? No. Only the dead have the right to forgive, and they're no longer among us. So I think it's very presumptuous for the living to forgive the crimes that were committed against the dead, and I certainly would not go there. There are the low estimates, 18,000 children who have been killed so far in Gaza. Far be it for me to forgive the perpetrators. So I don't even think it's a relevant question to me. That's not for me to decide. Let the dead decide. And they're not among us to do so.
The final question, since we have to wrap up in the interest of time. In a previous interview, you mentioned that you regret not asking Noam Chomsky whether he believed there was a purpose to life. I'm not going to make that same mistake now that I have you here with me today in the same room. So I'm going to ask you point blank, what is the meaning of life, Norman
I
Finkelstein?
have no idea. The older you get, the more you realize. The older you get, the more you realize there is no answer to that question, which is why I've become much more tolerant of religion as I've gotten older. Everybody tries to make sense of something which has no intrinsic sense. So, as Professor Chomsky and many others preceding him have said, there's no meaning in an objective sense of life. You create meaning. And when my parents passed away, since so much of my life had been devoted to vindicating the horror that they endured, suddenly when they passed, I couldn't find a purpose to life. And I would be like, Diogenes with the lamp looking for an honest man. I was looking, searching, what is the purpose to life? And I remember a friend of mine, she said to me, Norman, the purpose is not out there. You have to create the purpose. And the same thing with Chomsky, Professor Chomsky. He said the same thing. But that means, to some extent, you're in the double sense. You're fabricating a meaning to life in the double sense. Fabricating as in building, but also fabricating as in faking. You're fabricating a meaning to life. And so I have become much more tolerant of religion because I believe that we're all, to some extent, engaged personally in a fabrication. So for those who say there is no God, this is all ridiculous, and there's no man sitting upstairs, well, we're all engaged in a degree of fakery, fabricating a meaning. In my own case, the water is under the bridge. I made a decision at a certain point in my life that this is what I was going to devote myself to. And after a certain point, a threshold is crossed and it becomes automatic pilot. I get up in the morning, I answer my email, I do some reading, I go out either for a run or for a walk, depending on the weather. I come home, I read. This is, as it were, it's my destiny. And I don't ponder anymore whether it has any meaning or not. It's the destiny that, in part, I carved out. And at a certain point, it has a momentum of its own, and I just do it. I doubt very much in the last 30 years or even more, the last 40 years of his life, Professor Chomsky ever asked the question, what's the purpose to my living? It was set already.
Right.
Oh, that's my answer.
So I really appreciate your time. Thank you so much for this conversation.
Okay, nice to meet you.